Warning. This story contains explicit content that may be disturbing and offensive to some. It includes graphic depictions of violence, gore, rape, and other disturbing themes. Discretion is advised. Kregon's Dark World presents The Psychopath, written by Kregon. Chapter 1. The Hunter and the Hunted. The scorching sun beat down on the city streets of Kenner, Louisiana, in the summer of 1995. Alice had just finished her shift at the diner and was making her way home when she felt a presence behind her. She quickened her pace, but so did the man behind her. Suddenly, he lunged at her, grabbing her by the hair and dragging her into an alley. Alice screamed and kicked, but the man was too strong. He punched her in the face, knocking her to the ground. He straddled her and began to rip off her clothes. Alice begged him to stop, but he just laughed and continued. The man was Richard, a sadistic psychopath who enjoyed torturing and killing his victims. As he raped Alice, he whispered sick and twisted jokes in her ear. He enjoyed watching the fear in her eyes as he cut into her flesh, spilling her blood onto the pavement. After Richard was finished, he put on his clothes and walked away, leaving Alice for dead. But Alice wasn't dead yet. She lay there, bleeding and broken, trying to muster the strength to get up and run. Meanwhile, Sarah, Richard's wife, was at home preparing for bed. She had just finished taking a shower when she noticed that Richard's door was slightly ajar. She walked in and saw Richard putting on his robe. She was about to say goodnight when she noticed something strange about the room. The walls were covered in blood, and there were chains and ropes hanging from the ceiling. Sarah was horrified, and she demanded to know what was going on. Richard just laughed and said, "I have needs that you can't fulfill." Sarah tried to leave, but Richard grabbed her by the hair and pulled her back. He slapped her across the face and told her that she was his property. Sarah realized that she was trapped, and she knew that she had to get away. She went to Alice's sister, Emily, a private detective who had been hired to investigate Richard's business dealings. Emily had been suspicious of Richard for a while, but she had never suspected that he was capable of such horrors. Together, Emily and Sarah worked to bring Richard to justice. They searched for evidence of his crimes and followed him as he stalked his next victims. They were determined to stop him, no matter the cost. In the end, Emily and Sarah found themselves in Richard's playroom. The room was filled with torture devices, blood-stained walls, and the remains of his victims. Richard stood in the center of the room, brandishing a knife. Emily and Sarah began to taunt him, trying to unnerve him. They knew that Richard was a psychopath, but they didn't realize just how far he would go. As they continued to unnerve him, Richard began to lose his grip on reality. He saw images of his victims, taunting him and driving him insane. Finally, he snapped. With a scream, Richard charged at Emily and Sarah, knife in hand. But Emily was ready for him. She had a knife of her own, and she plunged it into his chest, killing him instantly. Emily and Sarah left the playroom, shaken and traumatized by the horrors they had witnessed. They knew that they would never be the same again, and that they would always be haunted by the memory of Richard's madness. Chapter 2. The thin line between reality and madness. Emily's mind was in a state of disarray. The events that had taken place in Richard's playroom had left her questioning everything she knew about reality. The blood, the gore, the screams of pain, all of it seemed like a distant memory, yet it haunted her every thought. One night, as Emily was walking home from a late-night stakeout, she stumbled upon a scene that would send her mind into a frenzy. A young woman was being raped by a group of men in a dark alleyway. Emily watched in horror, frozen with fear. As the men finished their vile act and began to walk away, Emily made a split-second decision. She pulled out her knife and lunged at them, seeking vengeance for the innocent victim. But as she plunged the knife into the first man's chest, reality seemed to shift. Suddenly, Emily was no longer in the alleyway. She was in Richard's playroom, surrounded by his twisted torture devices and lifeless victims. The man she had just killed was no longer there, but in his place stood Richard, grinning from ear to ear. "Good job, Emily," he said. "You're one of us now." Emily's mind raced with confusion. She couldn't tell what was real and what was a hallucination, but as Richard continued to whisper in her ear, she knew that she was in trouble. "You have to kill them all," he said. "Every last one of them. They're all just pawns in our game." Emily tried to resist, but her mind was already consumed by madness. She grabbed her knife and ran after the other men, slashing and stabbing with reckless abandon. But as she plunged the knife into the last man's chest, she realized that she had made a fatal mistake. It wasn't just any man she had killed. It was Sarah, her partner and only ally in this dark world. Emily collapsed to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. She couldn't believe what she had done. She had killed the only person who had ever shown her kindness. As she turned to run, she heard a swarm of police officers approaching her with guns drawn. The voices in her head were telling her to fight back, to kill them all, but she knew that it was over. "Freeze!" the officers shouted. Emily collapsed to the ground, covered in blood and tears. The knife was still in her hand, and she couldn't bear to let it go. She knew that her life would never be the same again. "I didn't mean to do it," she cried. "I was just trying to protect myself. Please, you have to believe me." But the officers didn't listen. They saw a crazed killer, not a victim of her own mind. They arrested her at gunpoint, dragging her away to a fate worse than death. Chapter 3. Embracing the Madness. Emily sat in her cell, waiting to be put to death for the murders she had committed. But as she sat there, she realized something that made her smile. She wasn't alone in her mind. After the events in Richard's playroom, Emily had developed a split personality. This new personality was the one responsible for the murders that had taken place after Richard's death. The trauma of what she had witnessed had caused her mind to fracture, and now she was living with a killer inside her head. But it wasn't just any killer. It was Richard. He had taken on a life of his own inside her mind, taunting her with his twisted ideas and violent tendencies. And now, Emily understood that he wasn't real. He was just a manifestation of her own inner demons. As Emily sat in her cell, she heard Richard's voice whispering in her ear. "You know what you have to do," he said. "Embrace the darkness. Embrace the pain." But Emily didn't feel afraid anymore. She felt empowered. She realized that she was in control of her own mind, and that she could make the voices stop whenever she wanted to. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, savoring the silence. The guards outside her cell heard her laughter, but they didn't know what to make of it. They had never heard anything like it before. It was a strange mix of joy and madness, like someone had cracked open the gates of hell and let the demons out to play. Emily opened her eyes and looked up at the ceiling. She knew that her time was running out, but she didn't care. She had found a new sense of freedom in her madness, and she was going to make the most of it. As she closed her eyes again, she heard Richard's voice one last time. "You belong to me," he said. "We are one and the same." But Emily didn't respond. She just smiled and let out a deep, guttural laugh. She knew that she was no longer a victim of her own mind. She was the master of her own destiny, and in Kregon's Dark World, that was all that mattered. It's a hell of a dark world, and Emily was ready to embrace it with open arms. The end! All right, you sick and twisted individuals, I hope you enjoyed this fucked up tale of horror and despair. I poured my heart and soul into this story, and I hope it left you feeling disturbed, unsettled, and maybe even a little turned on. I don't judge. But don't worry, my dark world is vast and endless, and there are more stories to come. More blood, more gore, more psychological mindfuckery that will leave you questioning your own sanity. So, If you want to keep up with my sick and twisted mind, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. You know the drill. To appease the YouTube algorithm and stay up to date with all of my latest atrocities. And if you have any story ideas or suggestions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I'm always on the lookout for fresh victims. I mean, inspiration. Until next time, my beloved sickos.